The Tide stares down Death Valley again and doesn't blink. Now the Bama Crimson Tide races for the Bullies. The Rebels, the Tigers, of course they're eliminated. Or are they? We will look deep into the top 10 and what the College Football Playoff Committee could be looking at if some other upsets happen around the nation. And how about the Gators sneaking in the back door to Atlanta? That could happen as well. It's a very real possibility in the SEC championship game for the ages. Maybe not when you have the best team taking on the seventh best team. This is the SEC in 60. I'm Mark Rogers of MarkRogersTV. Please check out my videos on YouTube and also at MarkRogersTV.com. Over 1,000 college football videos. This is a show that we do each and every week on Monday, right about noontime. You can catch us live on Google Hangouts. You might be doing that right now, catching us live on Google Hangouts. And then the show is released and ready for podcast at Mark Rogers TV on Podbean or on YouTube. Also on iTunes, I should say. And then also we've got the video ready for you on MarkRogersTV.com and also on YouTube. Okay, let's get to it. We could do 60 minutes of SEC football each and every Monday, and this is good stuff. We've got a cast of characters, or an esteemed cast, however you want to look at it. It starts out with Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com. Then we're going to bring in Brittnee Taylor Newman to break down the Heisman talk and also this SEC West mess. Brittnee writes for Football.com and also Last Word on Sports. And then finally, we get amped up. And while I'm probably drained of a little energy late in the show, we get pumped up with Stephen M. Smith of Touchdown Alabama. All right, another huge what could be elimination week in the SEC coming up. And before we do that, let's look back with Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com. Hey, Joe, how are you?
I'm doing great, Mark. Another great weekend in the SEC. Week number 12 shaping up to be a monstrous week as well.
I know, it's crazy stuff. And talk about crazy. Let's talk about what happened in Death Valley on Saturday night. Bama, of course, survives the game. LSU should have been able to put that thing away. They had the ball inside the 5-yard line with about a minute left to play. Couldn't convert the touchdown, had to kick the field goal and set it up for Blake Sims and company. So, on one hand, if you spin this the positive Bama, pro-Bama way, this is a signature win. You go to Death Valley. You do what Ole Miss could not. LSU is a much better team than they were earlier in the year. That's a big win. Hardly anybody wins in Death Valley on a Saturday night. You spin it the other way, and this football team, yeah, they made the plays near the end of the game. They also got a number of gifts in that game. So how do you spin this win for Alabama, and is Alabama a top 4 team?
I'm not so sure about Alabama being a top 4 team. Top 7, yes, but not top 4 at this point. Saw some major weaknesses on both sides of the ball for the Alabama Crimson Tide, but you have to give Nick Saban and Kirby Smart credit. That secondary came up big when they had to, held LSU to 76 total yards passing. That's a dominant effort that they can carry forward next week in Tuscaloosa against Mississippi State. But I saw some holes and some things that I didn't like offensively out of that team on Saturday night. Sort of crumbled a little bit under the pressure in the second half, but still a quality win. And when you look at the flip side with LSU, I don't think you could have asked for a better recipe in terms of game planning. John Chavis and Les Miles had the game plan in place. They had the game in their hands with a minute left, just could not convert, and the costly penalty really hurt that ball club. Just a costly personal foul at just the wrong time. Really gave Alabama enough time to drive down the length of the field and convert the game-tying field goal. And you have to credit Blake Sims for stepping up and really performing under the pressure in the last minute, something that he didn't do in the early part of the second half. I saw some early drops in the second half by Amari Cooper, uncharacteristic. So still a young team with Nick Saban, in my opinion, but they're starting to come together. Top 7, in my opinion, at this point.
You know, Joe, the committee is tasked to select the 4 best teams in the country. I have gone on rants to tell people how that's impossible. We don't know who the 4 best teams are in the country. So maybe the next step is to select the 4 best resumes. I think you can possibly do that. That's even very subjective. But they are tasked also to look at the football games and how well the games are played, how dominant the teams are, or how possibly fortunate, without using the word lucky, teams are. So it's one thing when a team takes a game over or is dominant in a game, or if they're losing, they come back and they make all the plays, which Bama made most of the plays. There were also some gifts that if you could have had, Alabama State out there, and LSU gave Alabama an unsportsmanlike conduct that pushed a probable touchdown inside the 5-yard line back to a 1st and 20 play for LSU that set up the field goal instead of a possible touchdown. Of course, LSU wasn't going to score a touchdown for sure. Their wide receiver, Trey Quinn, the freshman, dropped 2 3rd and short passes on big LSU drives late in the 4th quarter that would have converted, put them in field goal range. Again, Alabama did make the stop. LSU drops the pass. The kick out of bounds set up Alabama in great shape at the 35. So again, I credit, and before I have Tide fans all over me, I credit Alabama for going into Death Valley, getting the win, and doing it when they were backed up against the wall at 13-10 late in the football game. Again, they got a number of breaks, and the College Football Committee has been tasked to do a subjective thing, not an objective thing. That would be my system. It would be all objective, taken out of people's hands, but it's subjective. So they got to rate this win, and there's a lot of points you can make to say it's a great win, but there's also some other points to say, hey, it's not such a great win, a la some other wins across the country that have been tainted in a similar fashion. So, all right, Joe, let's talk about this Auburn situation, because I'm going to make a point later in the show as to why Auburn and Ole Miss may not be completely out of this thing, but it seemed like an elimination situation. Texas A&M, nobody expected. Everybody was looking at the Georgia game and, of course, the Iron Bowl, but Auburn gets knocked off as a 22-point favorite at home against the Texas A&M team that struggled to get past those Warhawks just the week before. So your thoughts about the Auburn tumble on Saturday?
Disappointed, because when people ask me who I thought the most complete team was after week number 11, I thought it was the Auburn Tigers for their victory in Oxford 2 weeks ago. But to follow that up with a very uncharacteristic, sloppy home performance where they lost the turnover battle 3-1, really couldn't stop Texas A&M's young offense with Kyle Allen at the helm, really started out slow, did not look focused, and really had to come from behind to get that ball club back into a position to win it. Very disappointed with Gus Malzahn and his team. Maybe they were looking forward towards Georgia, but this was a team that had its sights set on a national championship run, and to come out as flat as they did on the Plains in Auburn, very uncharacteristic and very disappointed in what the Auburn Tigers showed me on both sides of the ball.
And this is where SEC teams get a bit of a pass, and it's because of the strength of the league and the strength of the championships going back the last 7 years. If Auburn pulls this game out against Texas A&M, and the Aggies had lost 4 straight games in the SEC, they did win one over Louisiana Monroe. We give the teams in the SEC a pass. Some other teams across the country take a hit for only winning by a few points against like a 5-5 team. But Auburn, we would have been okay. That didn't look great, but you got the games on your resume and upcoming to prove how good you are. The distinction I want to make between what Auburn being possibly unlucky in this situation and Bama being lucky is that Auburn made those mistakes. They could not complete those snaps. So they had 2 botched snaps, one under center, one the other in the shotgun formation. They couldn't complete the football plays. Texas A&M was gifted. You could say Texas A&M got a bit lucky in holding Auburn the last 2 drives, but Auburn couldn't complete just basic, simple communication and football 101 plays, where Alabama was a bit gifted by LSU mistakes, if I can make the distinction there. Again, Auburn, 2 losses seem to be eliminated. We shall see what the last few weeks of the college football season hold, because there's not too many teams with one loss anymore, and they're ranked right behind them. So there could be a difference there, and there could be a slight opening for some 2-loss SEC teams to jump in there. Mississippi State, nothing to talk about in regards to the game, but it was good to see Dak Prescott healthy, running with some freedom. He's had the boot on occasionally because of the left ankle injury. Are you concerned at all about Prescott's health going into Tuscaloosa this Saturday?
I'm not. I think he showed me enough. I think they gave him just enough work, and he's looked good from what I've seen on the football field. I'm not concerned about the matchup in Tuscaloosa next weekend. I know that Dan Mullen and the staff have been cautiously watching him and really, sort of limiting what he does, not only in the games but in practice. So I'm not concerned as they head up to this battle this weekend with Alabama. I think he'll be fine.
For some reason, Joe, I'm intrigued by situations like Florida's in right now, where you have an embattled coach, you have a team that underachieves, everybody's ready to jump on them, and rightfully so in many instances, but they have a backdoor opportunity to go to the SEC championship game, and who knows what could happen. They took care of Vanderbilt on Saturday. It was the type of effort you would expect. Florida's a much better team. Despite their struggles in Vandy, they win at 34-10. They actually let Treon Harris throw the ball a little bit, threw for 215 and a couple of scores. They're going to have to be ready for South Carolina. And just your thoughts about the Gators. Are we making too much out of this, or do they have a real chance to possibly get to Atlanta?
They do have a possible chance. They have a solid defense that's solid in run support, and as long as they play the way they did against Georgia, this is a team that could be gelling at just the right time. Offensively, more of a blue-collar approach with Harris at the quarterback position. But as long as they can ground and pound the way they've been doing over the last couple of weeks, Mark, this could be a team that's just hitting stride at just the right time. I think they have a very difficult matchup this weekend with South Carolina because of Florida is their secondary, in my opinion. Georgia did not capitalize on that and did not challenge them, and Vanderbilt didn't last weekend, but I expect Steve Spurrier and Dylan Thompson to attack that secondary on Saturday. I think that's the weak point for the Gators, and I think that as long as Florida can get past South Carolina, you have to keep an eye out for them because they're playing a solid defense at this point in the season.
Yeah, let's stay on that path, Joe. Let's transition from last Saturday to this weekend. Let's stay on the path of that South Carolina-Florida situation because the Gamecocks had played themselves out of it. They were an East contender to start the season, started off with the embarrassment at home against Texas A&M, and they won some games, and they were right there, and have fallen off. The defense is not SEC championship level, and too many mistakes on offense. But Dylan Thompson slinging the ball, South Carolina, very formidable, goes to the Swamp to take on the Gators. Again, Florida at 4-3, Mizzou at 4-1 would seem to be a huge gap with just a couple weeks to play. But if the Gators win this to finish at 5-3, the Mizzou Tigers have shown us that they can certainly trip up, and they've got three decent teams in front of them. So South Carolina and Florida, we saw what the Florida run game is capable of a couple weeks ago against Georgia in that incredible 400-yard rushing effort with Taylor and Jones. Your thoughts about Florida, South Carolina?
Well, I think that the weakness of South Carolina is their rushing defense. When you look at the last two games against Tennessee and Auburn 3 weeks ago, they gave up 344 rushing yards to Tennessee and Joshua Dobbs. They gave up 395 to Nick Marshall and Auburn. So expect Florida to attack that middle of that South Carolina defense because that's the recipe to win against South Carolina from an offensive perspective. If you're Steve Spurrier and Dylan Thompson, I think you really have to try and throw over the top of Florida. Like I said, Georgia and Vanderbilt did not challenge the secondary, but you saw what they did against Alabama. They could not cover Amari Cooper. They couldn't cover the running backs in the flat or on wheel routes, and I think that Steve Spurrier will look to attack Florida vertically. If they can get some success, I think South Carolina poses a big problem. This is a solid quarterback in Dylan Thompson. He's not one of the best quarterbacks within the SEC, but he's surely capable of moving his team down the field, and I think he gives Florida a lot of headaches on Saturday. I think South Carolina pulls off the upset, if you're asking my opinion.
Oh, going to pull off the upset in the Swamp. I don't know what the line is on that game. I wouldn't consider that a huge upset, but I'm guessing that Florida's probably a 4 or 5 point favorite at home, since that's usually a 3-point swing. And yeah, Dylan Thompson is I expected him to have a better season. I think he could be, not using the term elite, a better quarterback in the SEC. The offensive line was supposed to be one of the better units in the SEC coming into the season. It just hasn't worked out for Steve Spurrier and company. You're listening to the SEC in 60 or possibly watching the SEC in 60, depending on if it's a podcast or video cast that you're checking us out on. We come to you every Monday at noon Eastern time. This is Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com. We're running down this week's huge matchups. And this one, not glamorous, Joe, but as you know, very important. Missouri's got to go to College Station, which suddenly, wow, it's a possible trap for Mizzou going to take on the freshman quarterback Kyle Allen and this rejuvenated Aggies team. So I don't know if they're going to consider that game on the Plains Super Bowl last week and then take the rest of the season off, or if this is just going to completely rejuvenate this team. The Aggies host Mizzou. Mizzou, as we say, is 4-1. They might just be like the 7th or 8th best team in the conference, but it's all sitting right for them. They control their own destiny to get to Atlanta.
Interesting matchup, Mark. When you look at it, Missouri and Texas A&M is a rivalry game. Both of these schools came into the SEC over the last couple of years, so this is the rivalry between both of these schools. You look at Matty Mock, offensively hasn't been hitting stride like last year, where he was really coming on at the end of the last season, really performing well in the system. This year they've struggled a little bit, relied more on their aggressive defense to shut down teams. They shut down Kentucky a couple of weeks ago, 260 total yards of offense they held the Wildcats to, and then now they're going to be going on the road to a very tough environment in College Station and Kyle Field. They're going to be without one of their defensive backs, who I believe was suspended for this game for rules violations. I'm not sure about his status, but I think he's been kicked off the team, so that hurts that defense going into this matchup. And look for Kevin Sumlin and Kyle Allen to attack the Missouri secondary at this point to see how strong they are entering this game. I think this is a very difficult game for Missouri. I think they're going to have to be able to rush the football to take the crowd out of the ball game. And from what I saw defensively out of Texas A&M last week, I like the way they're playing right now. They seem to turn it around in 2 weeks, and I think that this Auburn win will catapult them, and I expect them to be focused enough for this matchup. I think Texas A&M gets a solid home victory on Saturday.
And, Joe, this is the point of the season where we learn a lot about these teams in regards to their psyche, their mindset, their drive, their stamina, and the coaching staff's ability to get teams up. So for Missouri, are they going to play tight because they know it's all in their hands? They don't need to care what Florida or Georgia does. As long as they take care of business, they are the Eastern Division champions. Or do they play tight? Are they a focused, purposeful football team? Or are they a bit tight going into this situation knowing that it's all in their hands? Of course, they can rest on last season's experience when they came out of nowhere to win the East Division. Same thing for Texas A&M. Do they rest on last week and say, hey, that was the pinnacle. We pulled it off. We got a little fortunate on the Plains. We pulled it off, and now we're going to put it in cruise control, and it's going to be tough to get back up for that. Fortunately for Texas A&M, they're at home. The crowd's going to be there to amp them up 100,000 strong. So Texas A&M meets Missouri. You bring up Matty Mock. Yeah, I expected more out of him this season. They're winning in a very pedestrian style, relying on the defense, 20-10 over Kentucky. The Florida win, they scored a ton of points, but they were all interception, pick six returns. They were special teams plays. They did very little on offense. So Matty Mock, a guy that's in a day and age when we see quarterbacks, marginal quarterbacks, completing 65% of their passes, I know they like to go and hit for the chunk yardage and throw the ball downfield, a little less percentage type throws, but still barely completing 50% of his passes against SEC competition. So Mizzou, Texas A&M, again, not a marquee game, but a very important tilt in the conference. All right, Auburn and Georgia. I know, Joe, that these Bulldogs are driving you crazy because, again, it wasn't a great opponent last week, but they did what we expect them to do. They went to Lexington against a good opponent, an improved team under Mark Stoops that's recruited top 20 talent over the last 2 years. They're still a bit thin, but Georgia goes in there and just completely crushes them and shows us what they're capable of doing just a week removed from the Florida debacle. So we got Georgia, we got Auburn. I think a lot of people out there would expect before what happened last Saturday that Auburn is decidedly the better team. I'm not so sure because I think Georgia has more talent on defense. I think they have the capability of being a much better defensive team than Auburn, and that could be the difference if Georgia steps up and comes to play in this one.
Interesting, because I was waiting for that performance all year from Georgia to see what they were able to do offensively. I'm not sold why they didn't do that against Florida. You saw Hudson Mason throw for 4 touchdowns. He utilized his tight end. He utilized Chris Conley. He utilized Malcolm Mitchell. They have so many weapons offensively. They got Sony Michel back, who added 84 rushing yards. Isaiah McKenzie, who's a dynamic return man, also utilized in the slot. Georgia's loaded with weapons, and one of their big dogs is coming back this weekend in Todd Gurley. So who gets the football when this team is hitting stride on Saturday, we'll have to see. But I really like the way Georgia utilized their weapons offensively on Saturday. Very impressed with Mike Bobo. Shocked, though, that they didn't do it against Florida, because that was the team to really open it up against the weaknesses in the Florida secondary. But they learned from that game, and I think going forward, this is a dominant Georgia victory on Saturday. You look at Auburn, Mark, they're going to be without Williams. Their big play wide receiver got hurt last week against Texas A&M. Not as bad as people thought. The report on him is that it's only a sprain. He's coming back against Samford on November 22nd, but Auburn and Nick Marshall will not have him for this game. He's important for the passing game for a number of reasons. When you have Williams and you have Coates on the outside, teams can't double team both of those guys, so they usually double team Williams, and then that leaves Coates open for play action. Well, with Williams out of the ball game, they're going to double team Coates. Look for Georgia. They really give Nick Marshall and that offense some headaches defensively because Williams not there, and I think offensively right now Georgia's the better team, both passing and rushing. It's a week-to-week basis with these teams. It's not. There's no consistency, in my opinion, across the top 25. We have to keep it from week to week. And at this point, week number 12, Georgia looks like the more complete team at this point in the season. I think they get a dominant victory on Saturday.
Yeah, Williams is an impressive specimen of an athlete. I saw him for the first time during the spring game for Auburn. Extremely impressive, and he's come through with some big catches. Sammy Coates is the difference maker that they missed for 5 or 6 weeks, and he's finally stepping up and getting the football and making incredible plays in the passing game. So they would have that advantage over Georgia in the secondary. If Williams was there, you bring up a great point with him on the sideline and miss much of that Texas A&M game as well. For Georgia, despite the slip-ups, despite the disappointment, despite letting us down for those of us, Joe, who expected more of like a top 5 team, it's all right there in front of them. They have to be thinking Missouri's probably going to lose one of these 3 games against 3 decent teams, Texas A&M, Tennessee, and I'm not coming up with the other one, I believe Arkansas. And it's right there for them. They can still fulfill all their goals and dreams. If they get to Atlanta and they somehow pull off an upset there, they're a 2-loss SEC champion. So they get Todd Gurley back. I expect this team to be extremely amped for this game against Auburn. Who knows how the Tigers are going to respond to a possible elimination against Texas A&M. Again, whether they've got the drive and the focus to put that behind them, refocus, go between the hedges, and pull out this game against Georgia. Georgia definitely has the motivation. It's a championship. Auburn has to be thinking we're out of it at this point. But again, at number 9 in the nation, if upsets occur, even Auburn, I think, still has a glimpse of hope for that playoff when we talk about some chaos happening in the last few weeks. All right, Joe, let's finish off with the big one. Mississippi State, Alabama. Who would have thought this was the game of the year in college football this year? Although somebody pointed out to me a couple weeks ago in watching my videos that there was a certain analyst, commentator, that before, or this was after Mississippi State's bull romp over Rice, that had mentioned that this might be the Auburn of 2014. Don't know who that was, but actually mentioned that Mississippi State could be the next Auburn. So anyway, we got the Bulldogs and we got the Tide. And Alabama, they've got everything right in front of them. They could have lost it all at LSU, but they squeaked through, and here they are against Mississippi State. So break this thing down for us, Joe.
Well, Alabama's owned the series. They've owned Mississippi State by an unbelievable margin in terms of margin of victory over the last 10 years. So Mississippi State, from a statistical advantage, that doesn't have a lot going for it in that point. But what they do have is very solid offensive and defensive lines. I like their defensive line led by Preston Smith. I like Dak Prescott, Josh Robinson. And let's keep a couple of things bring it to the table right now. You look at the game that Johnny Manziel and Texas A&M knocked off Alabama. Everybody forgets that the week before, A.J. McCarron and the Alabama Crimson Tide went to Death Valley and got that signature 21-17 victory. They did come back home to lose to Texas A&M the following week. So this is not an easy game for Alabama just because they got that victory in Death Valley last weekend. This is a team that's still not winning the turnover battle. They're still negative in turnover margin on the year. The last time they were negative in turnover margin was prior to 2008. They still, in my opinion, do not look good and cohesive offensively. They put it together in the overtime period, but you saw what LSU was able to do in the second half. At one point, Blake Sims and that offense only had 35 yards of total offense midway through the fourth quarter. So not sold on Blake Sims, and I'm not sold on this Alabama team as a whole. People look at the Alabama team as a body of work from 2008 to 2014 and do not look at this team for what it is. I think if they can pick up the victory against Mississippi State, I'll change my opinion. But you saw some weaknesses that LSU was able to expose, and you saw some weaknesses that Clint Trickett and West Virginia exposed week one. So we'll see if Dak Prescott can take to the air this weekend. I think he challenges Landon Collins in that secondary, and I'm calling for the upset. I think Mississippi State strikes it. I think they're the more complete team offensively and defensively at this point in the season.
Well, again, if we try to be objective about this and try to take our eye test out of it, I think Alabama should be ranked in the top 3 just because they've gotten through a schedule that's as good as anybody in terms of conference play, as good as anybody in college football. If you're looking at an eyeball test, yeah, the Arkansas game's ugly, the Tennessee game, second half's ugly. This LSU game, I know LSU's really good, but they're deficient passing the football, so Alabama squeaks by there. So I think if you include the subjective nature, which is part of it, as the College Football Playoff Committee has been tasked to actually analyze the games, I would be on board with you. I think they're more like a top 7 or 8 team. I don't know if they're not that good, but that's what they've proven to date. Now, it's all right in front of them, so the argument becomes a null and void come Saturday when they've got number 1 in town and they can show us what they've got. And if they win that game by 1 point, it's the ugliest football game you've ever seen, 7-6. Hey, that's good enough for me. It's against number 1, and we know how good Mississippi State is. The thing that we can't measure right now, Joe, is Alabama's been there so many times. This is like a 5 or 6 times a year type of game. I know it's number 1, but number 1 doesn't catch them as a deer in the headlights. For Mississippi State, I know they beat Auburn. That was a huge game. And I know that they've been on the big stage. They went to LSU, but those games weren't like the entire nation watching. Now they go to Tuscaloosa, number 1 ranking on the line, undefeated season, possibly the college football playoff, and we'll just see how this young football team, well, they're really not a young football team. They have some definite experience, but in terms of being new to the spotlight and new to this type of situation, that's what we will have to see, and that's going to play out most notably in the first quarter, coming out of the gate. Are they a bit shocked? Do they get hit in the mouth? And it's going to happen late if there's a drive to be made that they have to drive it to win it or make a big stop to win it. We're going to see it in the fourth quarter when the pressure's on and it gets cranked up there late in the game. All right, we've got Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com, and if you want to hear Joe's picks, you got to join us on Tuesday night, late night at 12:30, or of course it's posted on video and a podcast, so you don't have to stay up late with us on Tuesday night. And Joe runs down the top 25 and makes all his predictions and previews right there. All right, Joe, we know you're on the road. Thanks so much for joining us, man.
My pleasure, Mark. I'll talk to you tomorrow night. Can't wait to talk about college football. It's great, isn't it?
I don't think you stopped talking about college football. So you're going to click the off button here, and I think you're going to go find somebody to talk some college football with.
You got it.
All right, that was Joe Lisi at GoFishing.com. Now we're going to bring in Brittnee Taylor Newman, who joins us from Florida. And Brittnee, we appreciate your time. Thanks for making the stop for us in your busy work week. Hope everything's going well for you. Hopefully you can hear me right now.
I can hear you. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Of course, of course. So we've had Brittnee on a number of times, and she always delivers, and she gives us some great off-the-beaten path subjects to talk about. So I'm not going to ask you if you enjoyed last Saturday. We all did, unless you had a particular rooting interest. Everybody enjoyed Saturday and another chaotic series of events. So let's start out talking about maybe a couple quarterbacks who are a bit off the radar, way off the radar, but maybe necessarily shouldn't be, because one of them is in that spoiler role right now as Texas A&M continues on, and another one has a chance to make a splash and get his team to Atlanta. So we're talking about Kyle Allen, the true freshman at Texas A&M. We're talking about Treon Harris, and we're coming off a year, of course, Brittnee, where you know that we might have had the best class of quarterbacks ever in the SEC with guys like Johnny Manziel, A.J. McCarron, Aaron Murray, Zach Mettenberger, who's starting in the NFL now, and our good friend James Franklin at Missouri, who led them to the SEC championship game. So these guys don't really rank with that class, but they're going to be very important to the way this thing plays out the last few weeks of the season.
Absolutely. I think it's a year of the haves and the have-nots in the SEC. It seems that everybody's either competing for number one or fumbling through their season, but I think that Gator fans and Aggie fans alike both have two very, very good reasons to be excited about the future, maybe not this year, but moving forward. And as you said, those two reasons are Treon Harris and Kyle Allen. Both freshmen. This weekend, they were both in their second career start. Ironic little statistic there, but Treon Harris went 13 for 21 in his passes, 215 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, no interceptions, was playing behind an offensive line that was injured. Will Muschamp referred to them later as a makeshift offensive line, but still managed to put in a stellar performance that didn't really denote the nerves that we would expect of a true freshman in his second career start. And then, of course, the other player that we talked about, Kyle Allen for Texas A&M, in for injured Kenny Hill, and he had a great day as well. 19 of 29, 277 yards, two touchdowns, well, four touchdowns in the air, only 1 interception for the entire game. Was named the Offensive Player of the Week by the Walter Camp Football Foundation, and we all knew he was going to be a good kid. He was ranked by some recruit websites as the #1 pro-style quarterback recruit coming out of high school last year, and we knew that he was competitive. He's been tweeting a little bit this year about how he wanted to compete for that position, even after Kenny Hill was named the starting quarterback, but fantastic performance by him. Was really kind of able to hold it together and show his competitive drive and his maturity. So good performances by both of them. I think that fans have a reason to be excited about the future, at least, if not this season, with those two quarterbacks at the helm.
They say, Brittnee, of course, that football teams can improve more between game 1 and game 2 than any time of the year, because of obvious reasons. I think that might have taken hold for Kyle Allen, because against Louisiana Monroe, yes, Louisiana Monroe, who had given up a zillion yards in those previous games, Kyle Allen could not move his football team. They win it by 5 points. They're at home in the comforts of Kyle Field, and that just really set them up for getting devoured, most people thought, on the plains, and just with a raucous crowd in his face, national television audience, he just really pulled through in that environment. That was impressive. And now Texas A&M, hey, they can play loose and fancy free and just try to make a decent bowl game and take on these contenders one by one. And they've got a Missouri team lined up against them this week that needs to win to maintain first place in the SEC East and get to the championship game. So like we talked about with Joe, is Mizzou going to be tight, or how are they going to play? But Kyle Allen showed us last week that, hey, even with the stakes on the line and everybody watching, that he could get the job done. And he was the #1 recruited pocket passer in high school football coming out last year. So this was expected, maybe not quite this soon in his career. And for Treon Harris, the run worked so well against Georgia, they piled up 400 yards rushing. He threw 6 passes. Now, if you would have told me that Florida could upset Georgia throwing 6 passes, I would have thought no way, because it seems pretty simple. Load the box, stop the run. But Treon Harris didn't need to do much. And then you mentioned what Muschamp said about the offensive line situation, and they put it on Treon Harris to throw, I think, 7 of the first 8 offensive plays last week. So they put it in his lap against Vandy. Now, the Vanderbilt defense hasn't been the best this year, so we may have to wait another week or two this week against South Carolina to really see if Treon Harris is up to the task against an SEC-level defense. So let's segue from a couple guys a bit under the radar that are just burgeoning onto the scene, just getting a start to their careers that may be foundational names in this conference for the next few years, to the guys that are looking to go to New York City and go to the Downtown Athletic Club. So your latest Heisman watch, Brittnee.
Well, it was interesting. We talked about 5 players to watch last week. 2 of those players, unfortunately, were on the field dressed in Auburn Tigers jerseys on Saturday night. So for Nick Marshall and Cameron Artis-Payne, the run for the Heisman presumably is going to stop there. And it's unfortunate. Cameron Artis-Payne actually had a pretty decent game Saturday night statistically, but when you start comparing the place that Auburn will be in with front runners that are fronting teams like Marcus Mariota at Oregon, unfortunately for these 2, it kind of looks like the end of the road for the Heisman. But we do still have 3 players from the SEC that we talked about last week that are still very much in the conversation. Blake Sims, quarterback for the Alabama Crimson Tide, didn't have a great game on Saturday night. He actually just completed 44.4% of his passes, but where I think that he probably sort of saved his run for the Heisman was in that very last drive and in overtime for Alabama. You saw him after the turnover with TJ Yeldon on the sidelines, encouraging everybody, rallying his team, getting them together. He led them that 55-yard drive there at the end of the game that led to the field goal in overtime. And then during overtime, he played better. 6 of 8 of his passes he completed. He kind of I think, helped rally the team to a return where at the end, in the last drive and in overtime, they kind of started to look like Alabama again, whereas at the beginning of the game, they did not. He was having trouble completing anything over 10 yards. The entire team was struggling. But I think that the rally that you saw, the leadership that you saw from Blake Sims and the improvement in his performance during overtime really probably kind of helped save what he's been building on all season. And then, of course, you can't talk about Alabama and the Heisman without talking about Amari Cooper. Still second in the nation for receptions. He's got 1,215 yards. He's just 56 yards shy of the all-time school record for reception yards at Alabama, which we all know they've got such a storied program. That's an incredible record to beat. He's 1 touchdown away from meeting the record that he set for 11 touchdowns during his freshman year in 2012. So he didn't have a huge standout game on Saturday night either, but certainly did what he needed to do to stay in the conversation. They'll both have an opportunity to improve their cases for the Heisman on Saturday night in the game against Mississippi State, which brings us perfectly to the front door of the 3rd candidate that we talked about, one Mr. Dak Prescott, quarterback of Mississippi State. Did what he needed to do last weekend as well, and threw for 206 yards, 14 of 23 he completed them, had 2 touchdowns. One of them was a rushing touchdown, was coming off an ankle injury. That didn't seem to be bothering him, so we may be able to expect the fully empowered Dak Prescott on Saturday night. But as we said, all 3 of them kind of did what they needed to do to stay in the conversation. No breakout stars, but the stage is set for all of that to change on Saturday night, so we'll have to see.
So, Brittnee, when it comes to the Heisman race, I've got a bit of a theory here, and I just came up with it in the last 90 seconds, so don't hold me to it. I think guys win it about 3 different ways. Either you overwhelm everyone with statistics. like Melvin Gordon's trying to do with Wisconsin, but he's not going to win it. Wisconsin's lost a couple games, but he's just knocking out like 175 yards a game, just overwhelming with touchdowns. We saw Monte Ball do it a couple years ago with like 30-some touchdowns and get into the Heisman race. Then you got guys that they get on the radar early in the season. Their team's undefeated, and they are the quarterback. So they're a quarterback of an undefeated team. Jameis Winston last year, of course, he had the gaudy stats, too. Dak Prescott, though, this year, not necessarily the gaudy stats, but he's got the #1 team. He's going to play the big games and the big spotlight games, and he could be the front runner because, hey, he's playing well as the lead guy for the lead team. And then you've got just the Heisman moments, those incredible plays, spotlight games, just incredible moments that will last through the ages, like a Doug Flutie against Miami way back in 1984 when he pulled off the play, the Hail Mary on Thanksgiving Day. His team didn't come close to winning a national championship, but he pulls off that play and he captures the Heisman Trophy. Of course, he had to have a good season before that. Just three different things that came to mind in regards to a route to a Heisman Trophy, and Mr. Marcus Mariota might have the best chance if all three of those factors are taken into consideration. All right, Brittnee Taylor Newman joins us from football.com and also Last Word on Sports. Brittnee, you told me before we came on that you were going to sort through the SEC West, so I'm at a loss. It's a bit chaotic at this point, aside from Mississippi State having the clear path. So I am going to leave it up to you to tell us what's going to happen or what could possibly happen. You mentioned a worst-case scenario for the SEC, and they're out there. I can't imagine that the SEC could possibly be left out of the Final Four, but what do you see possibly playing out?
Well, I know I promised you I'd sort through it, and I sorted, and I'm at as much of a loss as you are after all of that sorting. At this point, best case scenario, there's perhaps a clear winner at the forefront of all this, maybe your Mississippi State. But yes, those scenarios are out there, and unfortunately, it's in the committee's hands if all of those worst-case scenarios play out. You could look at a situation where Mississippi State loses to Alabama this weekend and then loses to Ole Miss Thanksgiving weekend, where Alabama loses to Auburn at the end of the season, and we end up with 3 2-loss teams there. And there are tiebreakers in place for the SEC championship game to help determine those things, but then if one of those teams emerges, goes to the SEC championship game, and then loses to Georgia or Missouri or whoever ends up there from the SEC East, then the committee is put in a pretty precarious situation of looking at 2-loss SEC teams and how to place them in a 14 college playoff system, which is really, really tricky when you're looking at the SEC West has had quite a few 3 highly ranked teams already in these first couple weeks of rankings compared to the rest of the nation. It is not a conundrum I envy. I think we might all be better off for the peace of this country if there was a clear winner coming out of the SEC West for this year, and we need to just go ahead and make plans to move to an 8-team or 16-team playoff system, because this is a prime example of how you could end up in a conundrum where a larger playoff is definitely needed, as we've discussed before.
Yeah, I think all you need to know about this playoff is 5 conferences, 4 slots. There's a problem there.
Yeah.
then you can point out the flaws from there, but that's the big one in my book. And you could actually have Florida. Now I'm going to throw out the craziest scenario possibly, aside from all that chaos in the West, is Florida loses to Florida State. Doesn't affect their SEC record. They're a 4-loss team. They go to the SEC championship game. They somehow win. And the Gators are the SEC champions with 4 losses.
What an inaugural year for the College Football Playoff Committee. Chaos abounds.
There it is. Well, we know somebody from the SEC West has to be there. I just can't imagine that after what we've seen and the superior play out of this division, which is, I don't think there's much of an argument, the best division in college football, that somebody has to make it out, regardless of what happens at the SEC championship game. But if that's a 2-loss team, it's going to be, if everything holds serve elsewhere, Ohio State, Oregon, TCU, Florida State undefeated, it's going to be a difficult argument, and I do not envy their task because I do not think it's going to work itself out like many do. All right, Brittnee, thank you so much for the time, as always.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you have yourself a great week. Brittnee Taylor Newman, football.com, and also Last Word on Sports. And now we go to the energy portion of the show. Stephen M., we've been on for about 45 minutes or so you need to bring us a boost here. We bring in Stephen M. Smith of TouchdownAlabama.net, and he also has a show called 15 and Counting. Check it out on YouTube, and I'm going to let him explain where else you can find him because he's all over the place. And we hooked up on Twitter at ESPN_future. ESPN_future. You can talk some college football with Stephen M. Smith. Hey, Stephen, how are you?
Doing just fine, Mark. And yourself?
I'm doing great. I am trying to figure this out just like everybody else, but I'm guessing we're just going to have to watch some more football next weekend and then figure it out from there because it changes week to week. So we're going to focus in on your main team, and believe me, folks, even though we catch Stephen for Alabama talk, this guy knows the SEC through and through. So again, you got to follow him on Twitter because he has got the SEC lockdown and specifically the Alabama Crimson Tide. So Stephen, you may have heard a little bit earlier in the show, I had some discussion with Joe Lisi at GoForThe2.com talking about Alabama and how good this team is or maybe isn't. I think that if we just pluck teams out of the air and threw them into a playoff, that I would be very comfortable with having Alabama represent me. I think they can line up with anybody in the country and win. I think that they're one of the top 4 teams in the country. But that's just my thought based on knowing their personnel, knowing how they play and how difficult the schedule's been. But if you look at the play, it's been spotty, and I don't know that the resume adds up to a top 4 team right now, but that works itself out because number 1's coming to town. So I want your thoughts about the LSU game, and I know you graded out the performance, so that's another thing people need to check out is your grading system for this team week to week. Because that's available and it's very insightful. So your thoughts about the Bama play against LSU, because as we talked about earlier on the show, on one hand, very impressive going to Death Valley and winning. On the other hand, a lot of miscues had to be handed to Alabama for them to get to overtime.
When you talk about this game, Mark, it was a lot of, as Nick Saban would call it, the team did not execute well in the first half. Did not display a lot of energy in the second half, but you kind of saw Alabama come back to life late in the fourth quarter, and especially in overtime. Look at the offensive line of Alabama, kind of some shifting going around. You had Cam Robinson, who had an ankle injury after the Tennessee game. He was cleared to play against LSU. We didn't see him at his fullest extent. Had some good plays on the offensive line and some rough plays there. You look at Austin Shepard, Leon Brown, the penalty bug continues to haunt Leon Brown, especially late in the fourth quarter and in overtime. I know Brittnee Taylor Newman talked about Amari Cooper, and Cooper, though he had 8 catches for 83 yards and 1 touchdown, yes, the record book is his. He's passed Julio Jones. Cooper's passed DJ Hall as Alabama's all-time leading receiver, but he had some drops in that game. Amari Cooper had 4 critical drops where Blake Sims would put the ball right there, and it goes right through his hands. Of course, Blake Sims had his own issues, battled with nerves throughout the entire game. He had 45 pass attempts, completed just 20 for a 44.4% completion clip. You could tell he was jittery. You can tell where he was thinking too much instead of just putting the ball in the right spots and leading receivers, thinking too much. The atmosphere at Death Valley, which is a pretty dangerous atmosphere, if I can say that, really gets to and rattles quarterbacks. But you also have to take the play calling of Lane Kiffin into consideration. I think Kiffin got too cute with the play calling. I felt like at times Alabama was able to establish a run game with T.J. Yeldon and Derrick Henry. Alabama was able to pick up 6 and 7 yards a pop on a few plays. You can consistently see after every time Alabama would run the ball well, Kiffin would revert back to the passing game, and it kind of stopped the flow of Alabama's offensive line wanting to assert its dominance. There were times in that game, as I mentioned, Alabama was able to run the ball, but every time they got a good run play off, Kiffin would revert back to the passing game. But as always, Alabama's defense rose to the occasion. Defensive lineman Jaron Reed, JUCO transfer Jaron Reed is an absolute monster on that defensive line. Had a phenomenal game, 15 tackles. You look at Brandon Ivory. Alabama fans haven't seen much of Brandon Ivory this year. Played a key role against LSU. He had 8 stops. Reggie Ragland continues to impress all offseason. The talk was Dylan Lee. But talk was Dylan Lee from Beaufort, Georgia, was going to take the reins of C.J. Mosley. No, sir. It's been Reggie Ragland, who continues to play well, who continues to have his nose on every play. Trader Priest had 9 tackles. And Cyrus Jones, for the criticism that he takes, Cyrus Jones has become Alabama's most consistent corner, played exquisitely on Malachi Dupree, defended him well. The one pass that Dupree caught a touchdown on Jones in that first half, that was a product of just a wonderful placed ball by Anthony Jennings. Cyrus Jones had the coverage, Anthony Jennings, just a better placed ball. But then ending up with Adam Griffith, who's been in a funk in the middle of the season, 2 for 7 on field goal attempts. What a way for this young man to really kind of pick up his confidence, making 2 clutch field goals. The 39-yard field goal to give Alabama a 10-7 lead at halftime, and then the 27-yard field goal from the left hash to send the game into overtime. Adam Griffith, what a way to bounce back, gather yourself, and make a big-time kick.
All right, Stephen, and maybe I'm imagining this. At the same time, Nick Saban, during his stay at Alabama, and he's a very old-school coach for the most part, I think he's softening to a certain extent. He's understanding that he needs to change to relate to these players, and I think he's done an admirable job of that in recent years, is that going back to his pedigree in the NFL, also at Michigan State and LSU, that he's typically a hardline kind of coach. And so while everybody else is patting his team on the back, he's basically saying, hey, we've got places where we need to improve. He's always lifting up the opponent. He's one of those old school coaches that isn't going to say, hey, this team's great. At the same time, this season, there seems to have been a flip in the script because everybody's taking their shots at Alabama. Everybody's criticizing. You went to Arkansas, barely won. That's horrible. This team's really not good. Look at their mistakes. Look at they don't play well on the road. Clint Trickett carved them up for 365 in the air, back and forth, and all of this. And it seems like when he gets an opportunity to talk, especially on national TV, he's proud of this football team. He recognizes the flaws, the mistakes, and he's trying to clean up those things. But he recognizes the heart, the drive, and he's proud of this team, and he typically is taking that opportunity to say, hey, these guys are fighters, and they're not perfect, and this may not be a great team yet, but hey, we're in it, and people need to recognize that this is a tough conference, so you just don't maul everyone 50-0, and I'm proud of this team's efforts.
Mark, this has been one of Saban's best coaching jobs yet with this team. As I mentioned on the show a couple of weeks ago, this is the 2014 Alabama. It's not 2009. It's not 2011. It's not 2012. This is 2014 Alabama. Yes, you don't have A.J. McCarron. You don't have Kevin Norwood. You don't have Julio Jones. You don't have the array of defensive talent that you had in previous seasons, but so many people measure stats. They don't measure the heart of a team, the chemistry of a team, the focus of a team. This is the most well-gelled team chemistry-wise I've seen. These guys bond with each other on the field. They bond with each other off the field, and you saw evidence of it against LSU. When Alabama got down, when the offense struggled, when the defense struggled a bit, you didn't see this team throwing a towel. They came together, they rallied around each other, and they willed themselves to win. You look at Blake Sims. He's not A.J. McCarron, but you see what he's able to do. He's able to compose himself, come out there on the field, get these guys to buy into, we're going to win this game. We're going to win this with a championship mindset and execution. I go back and I look at that 50 seconds left on the clock against LSU in the fourth quarter. Talk about a 2-minute drill executed well in 50 seconds. Blake Sims, clock management. That's what all good quarterbacks need to have. The ability to recognize clock management, get the ball in the hands of your receivers, the receivers getting out of bounds, conserving time, being on the same page. This is what makes this Alabama team special. The chemistry, people being on the same page and clicking at the right time. It's not the teams that Alabama and Coach Saban have had in years past, but the one thing that this team has that even last year's team did not have, Mark Rogers, the chemistry, the focus of everybody being together, everybody appreciating and enjoying each other. You even saw it with the coaching staff. I mean, Kirby Smart does not get animated a lot, but when that game reached final, Kirby Smart goes and just grabs Lane Kiffin, just grabs and hugs Lane Kiffin. You don't really see that. I mean, Nick Saban's over there going, yep, another win. Great job. But you see Kirby Smart just maul Lane Kiffin, hugging Lane Kiffin. You can see the passion from this year's team, even in the coaching staff.
Well, we've certainly questioned the hiring of Lane Kiffin, questioned Lane Kiffin's approach to coaching hires at other universities and in the NFL. There's no doubt that Lane Kiffin's the offensive coordinator at Alabama because Nick Saban knows how talented he is. And I think that's Kirby Smart basically saying, hey, this offense struggled and we had to prop you up for a lot of this game, but on that key drive, you made all the right moves and knew what you needed to do to move the team into field goal range, and you pulled all the right levers, and you know your personnel to know which plays to call and where to throw the football. So I think people at Alabama are realizing the talent of Lane Kiffin in play calling and setting up matchups for that offense.
Well, Kiffin does a great job of executing matchups and pinpointing, which people to attack. I look at the final play of the game where Blake Sims looks at the sideline to Lane Kiffin, and it was actually going to be a called draw play to Derrick Henry on that final drive. That was the assumed call, according to Nick Saban. But Blake Sims looks over at Lane Kiffin, and Kiffin just does this subtle motion to flip the play. And so the play goes from a call draw to a rub pick play. They had Amari Cooper set a small pick, and you have DeAndre White come out the backside to the back of the end zone and perfectly placed ball by Blake Sims to White's outside shoulder. DeAndre White, who's been banged up for the majority of the season, my goodness, came to life in the fourth quarter and in overtime with a key 17-yard catch to set up Adam Griffith's field goal, and, of course, the 16-yard touchdown from Blake Sims that was the eventual final score of the game for Alabama, winning 20-13. But as I've stated, Blake Sims looking over to Lane Kiffin, Kiffin giving Blake the green light to change the play that was supposed to have been a draw play up the middle to Derrick Henry gets quickly changed to a pick play fade route to the back of the end zone for DeAndre White.
So again, Alabama sits at number 5. We get the latest rankings coming out on Tuesday night. They could possibly move up, and we would all expect them to move up after a win in Death Valley. For as impressive or unimpressive as it is, the LSU Tigers are a serious football team, and Alabama went in there and came away with a win. So I would expect them to be in the top 4 moving forward. And on a side note, I think this speaks to the depth of the conference and the division. When LSU, sure, they got dropped in the rankings to number 20, which I think is a bit harsh. I think it's a bit much when you talk about losing at the gun in overtime and in many respects outplaying the 3rd or 4th ranked team in the country and dropping from 14 to 20, 6 spots in the rankings. I think that's a bit harsh. I know you got to penalize teams because they're down to 7-3 now, but LSU, aside from not having a quarterback situation where they need to desperately build something in the passing game and have some kind of threat there, otherwise this might be one of the top 4 or 5 teams in the country aside, again, from the quarterback position. So just a side note on LSU, I think we've seen it against Ole Miss and against Alabama. They're a really good football team and nothing to be ashamed of marching out of Death Valley with a victory. So we spin it ahead, Stephen, to Mississippi State and your keys to victory for the Tide.
My keys to victory for the Tide, number 1, Mark, defensively, you have to affect Dak Prescott. Dak Prescott this season has 7 interceptions. From watching the Kentucky game, one thing I learned from watching the Kentucky game against Mississippi State and the Arkansas game against State, Bud Dupree of Kentucky, Darius Feinlaw, and Trey Flowers of Arkansas consistently got to Dak Prescott. They kept him in the pocket in the second half. They used stunts with their front four guys. They blitzed often with linebackers, and they kept Dak Prescott in the pocket. Didn't let him break contain and use his speed. When Dak Prescott breaks contain and uses those legs, he's a dangerous weapon because not only can he run, but young man can throw the football on the run. So Alabama has got to contain Prescott in the pocket. In this scenario, Reuben Foster becomes the biggest asset for Alabama. He's the fastest linebacker on the team. Reggie Ragland, the hardest hitter. Trey Priest, the most instinctive, but the fastest linebacker on Alabama is Reuben Foster, and this is where he becomes huge if he starts in this football game because Kirby Smart would have to spy him on Dak Prescott. Alabama cannot afford to play combo coverage. You saw against LSU. When Alabama played combo coverage, they took a linebacker away from the middle of the field, which allowed Anthony Jennings to convert a lot of those third downs with his legs. Alabama has to keep a linebacker in the middle of the field to keep watch of Dak Prescott, rush 4, and the back 5 of that secondary. You have a tough task containing likes of Jeronian Wilson and Jamion Lewis, and also the host of other weapons that Mississippi State has defensively. Also, from the linebacker standpoint, Reggie Ragland. He took on Leonard Fournette last week. He has the human bowling ball, Josh Robinson, to battle with this week. Can he be able to stop Robinson in the hole, make clean tackles in space? That's another big deal. Going over to Alabama's offense, Blake Sims, another moment, another game for him to really prove himself once more, using his mobility, but also being able to continue to spread the wealth. Blake Sims at home this season, completing 73% of his passes inside of Bryant-Denny Stadium. His ability to spread the wealth is much stronger at Bryant-Denny, basically because of the home crowd there, but Sims has got to spread the wealth, keep his eyes downfield, use his mobility. Alabama's offensive line has to create the run lanes, has to protect Blake Sims. You're going up against a very stout defensive line. You're going up against one of the best linebackers in the nation, and Bernard McKinney. And let's not forget that back 5 of Mississippi State, pretty stout, led by Jamison Love and Tavez Calhoun, and also Will Redmond, who's coming on strong himself. So Alabama offensively, the ability to establish a run game early, Blake Sims sharing the wealth with everybody offensively. And when you go to special teams, J.K. Scott has to start kicking the he punts the ball well, but at times he tends to out-kick his own coverage. Can he be consistent in kicking the ball so that his coverage can go down there and make plays? Adam Griffith, as always, focusing in on making clutch kicks when he needs to. But defensively, they have to have a linebacker in the middle of the field, spying on Dak Prescott, limiting the run game of Josh Robinson, and that back 5. Can Cyrus Jones continue to grow and play well? And Landon Collins, as the leader of that secondary, can he get everybody in place and ready to play a fundamentally sound football game? Alabama cannot turn the ball over. Alabama's defense, at least 4 sacks. At least 4 sacks to Dak Prescott and force at least 2 turnovers.
The College Football Playoff Committee is going to have a real quandary if Mississippi State goes to the Egg Bowl and takes care of business, and Bama does likewise in the Iron Bowl. And this is a classic game. This is a great game. Neither team proves to be dominant over the other. It's just Bama wins at 24-21. Mississippi State pulls off a slight upset on the road. They win 24-21. Or it's a very good football game, and both teams just show that they are just serious contenders. And so it's going to drop Mississippi State a couple spots. Or, man, even if Alabama loses by a point or 2 and then takes care of Auburn, wow, it's just going to be difficult to keep both of these teams, again, if they hold serve elsewhere, to keep them out of the playoff otherwise. But could be an elimination game, especially on the Alabama side. Mississippi State has a little more wiggle room with the undefeated record at this point. But I tell you, even though we've pointed out the flaws many times here on Mark Rogers TV of the Alabama Crimson Tide, again, if they lined up tomorrow at a neutral site against Oregon or against TCU, my money would be on Alabama. Against Florida State, I just think what we saw Saturday night was a typical Alabama-LSU game where it wasn't pretty, but that's grown man football, that's big boy football, and those teams in the trenches are just it's just a different rung of football than what we see, especially in the Big 12 and in the Pac-12, and also the ACC to a certain extent. So, all right, Stephen M., appreciate the time, always the breakdown, and I think we got a glimpse there of what you bring to the table, not just with the Alabama Crimson Tide, but again, you are all over the SEC, so I want to make sure that people know where to find you. So just run down the litany of platforms that we can find you on.
I wouldn't call it a litany of platforms. I call it Team No Sleep. I call it Team No Sleep of platforms there, Mark. So I guess I'll take a quick run down this list here. Hey, fans can always find me on Twitter, ESPN_Future. Once again, that's Stephen M. Smith at ESPN_Future. And now here come the platforms. The main one happens to be Touchdown Alabama Magazine. Touchdown Alabama Magazine covering all Alabama football from breakdowns, previews, recaps, practice photos, practice videos, just the entire rundown of Alabama football, even 15 and counting in the S&S show are all products of Touchdown Alabama Magazine, and that site can be found on Twitter at TD Alabama. Once again, that's Touchdown Alabama Magazine at TD Alabama. I've hooked back up with Chad Neepling, and I'm writing for SEC Sports Insider, that Twitter site at SEC Sports Insider. That's Chad Neepling, SEC Sports Insider. I'm covering Alabama football and also recapping SEC action on that standpoint. I do some writing for Pick 6 Previews. That Twitter handle is at Pick 6 Previews, doing Alabama, SEC, and also college football from a national standpoint. And I guess if I have to throw one more out there, that last one would be Planet Weekly. Planet Weekly, bi-weekly newspaper for Tuscaloosa, Alabama, covering all of Alabama football from Planet Weekly as well. That Twitter handle being at Planet Weekly. So the dream of Team No Sleep still living large there, Mark.
I think you need to run with that handle. That's good. You could run with that little platform, college football team with no sleep. That's pretty much what it is, Stephen. And when I think I'm grinding, I just look at my Twitter playlist. I look at the feed list on Twitter, the tweet list, and I just see that you're working hard. So I can't keep up with you. So I appreciate the time. One of these days, Stephen M. will have you on earlier in the show. I've had to slot a few guests at specific times at noon and 12:30. But we'll get you on a little bit earlier in the show, and hopefully we can catch up with you and maybe do a little Mississippi State post pregame or postgame, either or, to prep this mammoth matchup in the SEC West.
Oh, Mark, I'm looking forward to that. That will be exciting.
All right, sir. We appreciate the time. We're going to wrap things up here on the SEC in 60. Again, Mark Rogers and MarkRogersTV. Please join me on Twitter. We talk college football constantly, 24/7, 365, with guys like Stephen M. Smith and bloggers from all over the nation, all over the country, from SB Nation, Bleacher Report, and a number of other platforms. You can catch us on MarkRogersTV.com and also on YouTube at MarkRogersTV, where we posted over 1,000 college football videos, and we take on not just the SEC but the entire country, and again, bring on bloggers that know their stuff from top-level sites, and also coaches. We've had on about 14 different coaches from across the country the last couple of years, and expect to get some more on as well. This is the SEC in 60, and it posts to the SEC Radio Network, so it's SECRadioNetwork.com. Check out Dr. SEC's site right there. He's asked us to do this show, and we are so thankful to him for letting us put this thing together each and every Monday. So we'll be available on podcast and also on YouTube in just a couple hours on Monday afternoon. So enjoy the football, everybody. God bless, and we want to hear from you on Twitter and also on YouTube and at MarkRogersTV.com. And until next time, may God bless you and enjoy the football.